Another thing that people are interested in studying white collar crime has to do with ideas based on routine activities theory. And the idea here being, what is it about workplace opportunities that make white collar crime possible and more or less likely? So, when you think about the nature of white collar crime, committing a crime in the act of doing your otherwise legitimate job, the workplace actually has many criminal opportunities. If you think about it, regardless of what job you work in, there's almost always an opportunity at various points in the day to either steal or take advantage of things like work hours, saying that you worked longer than you did. There's a lot of different ways that you can basically manipulate your job and resources within your company to your advantage. And one of the reasons for that is most workplaces are based on a certain amount of trust between employee and employer. There is only so much oversight that an individual person within a company has on a day-to-day basis. Usually that's a very minimal concern of an employer. Um, if someone within your company has, 4 or 5 workers underneath him, he's much more concerned about their output and what they're producing and how much they're improving profits than he is monitoring their timesheets, monitoring their bank accounts. There's the point that white collar criminologists try to make, people that research this, is that there are some people who are going to take advantage of these kind of situations and these kind of opportunities that the workplace presents. So, two researchers, Benson and Simpson, in 2009, did a pretty extensive study of white collar criminal opportunities. And they basically established in their research that there are 3 properties that almost always have to be present for white collar crime to exist. So you can see how this kind of parallels the ideas of routine activities theory. The idea that these things that have to converge in order for crime to happen. Um, that's what these theorists are asserting. So for Benson and Simpson, they believe that the 3 properties that really have to be there for white collar crime to take place, first of all, is you have to have legitimate access to the crime location. If you're somebody who is working at a job, you have legitimate access to that office, to their resources, to their computers and their files. So that is something that has to happen for white collar crime to take place. It also tends to be the case that the offender, the person within the company committing the crime, is spatially separated from the victim, if there even is an identifiable victim. So one of the properties of white collar crime is the fact that when people commit white collar crime, either against their company or against shareholders and the public on behalf of their company, there's usually a lot of space between them and the person that somewhere along the line is getting victimized. When you think about traditional kind of street level offenses, usually the offender has a lot more contact and is a lot closer, at least, to the victim. Whether or not it's a person crime or a property crime, there's not that much separation between the two. But when you're a white collar offender and you're slowly embezzling money over time, you're very separated from the idea of actually harming a specific person or victimizing somebody in particular. And another property of white collar crime that really has to take place in order for white collar crime to take place, according to Benson and Simpson, is this superficial appearance of legitimacy. And what they mean by that is most people who commit white collar crime do it while on the surface and by all other accounts are conducting themselves in a legitimate way. So this isn't something that people do it and brag about it or are very obvious about it. This is something that people do usually under the surface, doesn't really um, doesn't really interfere often with their legitimate normal job, and they kind of maintain a superficial appearance of being law-abiding, of being by the book. So the last area that white-collar researchers are interested in doing research into is this idea that really got presented back with Sutherland in the 1930s The idea that white collar offenders are, in all other aspects of their lives, fairly respectable people. So the idea that this is a crime of respectable offenders. And the question that researchers would ask So the question that researchers would ask when faced with this kind of characterization is, how is this really possible? How is it that respectable members of a community could engage in such disreputable acts? And, researchers have a lot of different ideas for what might actually be going on for people who are white-collar offenders. One of the ideas that's been suggested is maybe these people aren't really that respectable in the first place. Maybe what they've been able to do throughout their life is simply avoid detection, and they've committed a variety of white-collar and otherwise criminal acts throughout their life, and have basically been grown up being accustomed to getting away with whatever they want. Another idea that's been presented is maybe white-collar offenders actually do share some traits with, your kind of predatory street offenders. Maybe these people are impulsive. Maybe they do have low self-control and are fairly antisocial. It's just that they were able to maneuver themselves into a business, into a working position, and because of these traits that they have, perhaps that explains why once in these positions they manipulated them and took advantage of them to their own benefit. And when you think back to the ideas of labeling theory, if you remember back to labeling theory, one of the critical issues for causing someone to become kind of a serious, hardened criminal is when they're labeled and identified as a criminal. And one of probably the most common traits among these white-collar offenders is, until they get caught the one time, nobody ever thinks of them as criminal. So they themselves kind of maintain a law-abiding, upstanding citizen persona. They keep that as kind of their master status, and that allows them to kind of continue on committing white-collar crime. It takes getting caught and labeled to really change them. So these are all kind of ideas that white-collar criminologists, people who are interested in studying this, are looking at right now. This is still a very young, growing field, but you have to admit that it is very interesting to think about. Why is it that these people who, by all accounts, at least have some things going for them, why is it that they would put all of those things at risk to commit crime? And again, if you think back to the stereotypical white-collar offender, you're talking about somebody who is middle income, middle class, probably at a mid-level range in their company. So, these aren't people that are always millionaires and billionaires, but they nevertheless have good jobs. They have a standing, a social position. They have a lot to lose. So it is an interesting question for theorists to wrap their brains around. What is it about these people that allows them to justify what they're doing and allows them to think that the benefits are worth all of the cost? You think back to David Matza's work, way back when we talked about subcultural theories. If you remember, David Matza described these techniques of neutralization. These techniques of neutralization that offenders use to kind of temporarily allow themselves to break with what they know is right and wrong. So according to Matza, offenders, and he was talking about young boys, offenders are primarily people who know the difference between right and wrong. They understand that what they're doing is wrong. And in order to justify doing things in their head, they have these techniques that they use to neutralize their normative controls, their normal kind of conscience idea of right and wrong. That's what allows them, according to Matza, to break the law in some situations. Well, people who study white-collar crime think that this theory is actually very translatable to the process that goes on with white-collar offenders. So according to people who study white-collar crime, it's probably the case that people who commit white-collar crime are, by most accounts, law-abiding citizens, but when they decide to break the law, they go through techniques in their head to kind of neutralize their feelings and justify the behavior, justify their actions. So an example of something that white-collar researchers believe is going on, first of all, one of the techniques they think, is pretty translatable from Matza's ideas is the denial of being a true criminal. So what white collar researchers believe goes on is, before somebody is about to commit one of these acts or decides to engage in kind of the long process of committing these acts, they basically deny that what they're doing is actually really that wrong or criminal by saying things to themselves like, well, I'm just doing what everyone else in my business is doing. I need to do this to keep up, to fit in. So that would be one example of somebody kind of neutralizing the criminality of what they're about to do. According to them, another kind of thought process that could go on is, this job underpays me, I deserve more, so I'm going to take more. The idea that, you actually have what you're about to steal coming to you, that you've earned it, you're not getting it through normal channels, so you're going to do it yourself. According to, white collar researchers, all of these are examples of neutralizing your more normative controls that are normally controlling you and prohibiting you in your mind from breaking the law. And another technique that they think, that the white-collar criminologists think is probably at work, is techniques where the offender or group of offenders who are about to engage in a white-collar offense really believe that the actions that they're about to do are necessary to make profits. So if you think to some of the larger scale white-collar offenses, the corporate crimes, the Ford Pinto case or the Toyota case, there are probably groups of people within that company making decisions who decided that the actions that they were about to take, which are undeniably criminal actions, were necessary to make profits. It was worth whatever risks were going to come to make the profits that were in sight. So according to somebody who believes in kind of these techniques of neutralization, that's an example of kind of minimizing the damage. Well, I had to do this. It's not just my fault. I had to do this for my company. Kind of appealing to higher authority. So it's kind of a good example of how, a theory that wasn't really designed to talk about this, techniques of neutralization were designed to explain young adolescent boys, but white-collar criminologists believe it's actually pretty translatable to the white-collar crime scenario. So in terms of what is and is not a white-collar crime, there's still really a lot of debate about what should and should not be considered in this category. If you're going to go by the kind of FBI's report, the FBI publishes basically a financial crimes report every year, and it's got all the things that you see listed on this slide as examples of white-collar crimes. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and especially if you're talking about maybe lower level, occupational white-collar crime conducted by individuals, sometimes it's maybe not at the scale of things on this list, but nonetheless, these things are all definitely examples of white-collar offenses. So when you think about corporate fraud, the majority of corporate fraud cases that the FBI is interested in involve things like accounting schemes designed to deceive, to trick investors, auditors, designed to trick analysts about the true financial situation of a corporation. So basically, in corporate fraud, the things that, at the scale that the FBI is interested in, that's when companies manipulate their financial data and manipulate the share price of their company so that basically the corporate remains are artificially inflated. Obviously, corporate fraud is one of the biggest things that the FBI is interested in because it can have the most damage to kind of the U.S. economy, to investors, to the public. But there are a bunch of other types of financial crimes. You've got securities and commodities frauds. That's an example of that would be people who illegally manipulate the money markets, manipulate investments, investment fraud. Healthcare fraud is another really huge area, especially since the economic collapse. And essentially, what the FBI examines for healthcare fraud would be people who illegally receive Medicare or Medicaid benefits. But, at the larger level, that's kind of at the individual level. At the larger level, an example of healthcare fraud would be healthcare companies manipulating documents and marketing products without authorization, billing for services that they haven't actually rendered, or claiming patent claim on drugs that they don't actually have claim to. Those are all examples of kind of healthcare larger level frauds. Mortgage fraud is obviously something that's made the news quite a bit in the past few years. In the financial crisis, fraud perpetrators were basically exploiting lending institutions and avoiding detection. So obtaining loans based on improper paperwork about your qualifications, getting a loan that you actually shouldn't be qualified for. Taking a loan without having any intention of paying it. So those cases are really rapidly growing. They went from about, just to give you an example from the FBI reports, in 2005, there were only about 720 of those kind of cases in the annual report. In 2009, there were 2,700. So this is something that has seen a huge amount of attention in the past few years. Things like insurance fraud, the most common there would be insurance agents and insurance brokers kind of diverting policyholder premiums for their own benefit. Mass marketing frauds would be things like, asking for advance fees. For any of you who've ever gotten an email from kind of a person overseas who needs money to come over to this country, asks you for an advance. Those are mass emails that get sent out to defraud us. And things like lottery and sweepstakes frauds, asking people to submit money or personal information in exchange for things that never end up coming. And obviously money laundering is the business of the FBI. The process by which criminals conceal, essentially, the proceeds of their crime, convert them into goods and services, and have the money come back. So all of those are examples of things that would come up on the FBI's report of financial kind of white-collar crimes. And those tend to be, again, these tend to be things at the larger level. But you can all probably think of examples of kind of lower level, more occupational types of white-collar crime where individuals are just embezzling. A future area, an area that has a lot of interest anyway in terms of white-collar crime, is how people are using the internet to conduct different types of white-collar crime activities. So the area and our understanding essentially of cybercrime is something that's very new and really growing. The internet is, at least in terms of research, a fairly young beast, and we still have a very small understanding of how people are using it to defraud and manipulate. The Internet Crime Complaint Center is something that's actually a fairly new being, collecting data and information about how many people file complaints based on losses incurred over the internet. In 2010, it was about 315,000 complaints, about $617 million. Those numbers just go up every year. And to give you an idea of, some of the most common cybercrimes that people report, online predators are definitely things that get a lot of attention. People who are trying to either solicit or sell pornography over the internet. Advance fee frauds are a huge problem. Things like the letters coming over from countries like Nigeria, that tends to be a popular example. Credit card fraud, people hacking into people's personal accounts. All of those protection services and locked secure sites that you guys see now on the internet. In the first, dozen or so years of the internet, people were putting their information, very personal information, on the internet without really understanding that it could be accessed. And credit card fraud over the internet is a huge and growing concern. Account hacking fraud, another issue, stealing personal information, people's social security numbers, being used. And another really, obviously huge issue is now that people are buying more and more things online, that also means that people can try to defraud and promise to send things for money and those things never end up being the case. So again, this is a growing field, a field we know very little about yet. But for those of you who are interested in cybercrime and understanding kind of white-collar crime through the internet, through technology, it's definitely a huge growing field to get involved in as someone studying crime. Next time, we're going to talk about organized crime, and you have a reading Hagen chapter 12. So make sure you come to class on Thursday having read the organized crime chapter of your textbook, and I will see you on Thursday.